Hey class, welcome back from spring break. I hope you found some time to relax, find some time to unwind. I know it wasn't, as long as we want it to be, but we're within the last, I guess, a little over a month left in school for this semester. So, there's summer coming up, and I know we just have to go through this final stretch before the end of the semester, and there's a couple things we need to cover in order to get through this, what I assume is a full and robust survey of social media. Your responses so far have been, as I always say, is fantastic. It does show that you're learning a lot. It seems to me like you're gaining a lot from this, so I'm really, really happy that a lot of this is coming across. I'm going through your midterms quite slowly at this point, but I'll be getting through that. This week is a little more low-key. I wanted to post today as to respect the fullness of your spring break. I didn't want to post during spring break because you deserve that time, So this week we only have one assignment and one reading, so you get through it. It's actually a reading and a half because you have like a little bit of an intro piece to get to before you get to the reading. The reading is a bit long, and the deadline won't be as tight because we are switching gears just a little bit as we head into the final stretch of the class. The final bit is about social media marketing and about what we do with social media. So marketing, I'm going to use that term not in the very neoliberal sense as in making money, but I'm going to use it in the term of like amplification, how we take our own person and we use it. That's to amplify your product, amplify your personal brand, amplify a cause, use it for activism, but there's all mixed in with different ways that we do social media marketing. And so that's going to be the last stretch of the course. For today, though, we're going to cover fake news. It's probably the last bit of real critical media that we're going to be talking about. One more piece of critical media we'll be getting through, of course, embedded within the marketing, is about how it works and how profit models exist. We're also going to talk a little bit about revolutions or reformations, depending on how you want to put it. Which are included in what happens when marketing scales fully. And that's something we'll approach critically at the very end of the course. But today we're going to be talking about fake news. And fake news is a bit of a charged term at this point, as you're probably very well aware. The bit you're going to read first is about why we should probably call it false information rather than fake news, just because it alludes to something that's a less partisan or antagonistic. But I want to tell you a bit of a story before we get into what the reading is going to be. So a lot of this all starts at a very historical moment that I use as a pivot point in my lectures. And I've been using this pivot point for as long as I've run the new media major at my previous institution and in pretty much all the lectures I do on this subject. And I think it's a really important moment in history that we don't really think about too often, but really changed the world. And everything changed on January 15th, 2009. Now, off the top of your head, you probably don't know that date or know why that's an important date. But what you should know is that Tom Hanks played the main part of Sully Sullenberger, who is the reason why that date is important. That was the day of the miracle on the Hudson. That was the day that an airline struck a bird and had to make a crash landing in the Hudson River. That actually isn't the most important part of the story in terms of what today has to do with it. The most important part of that story is about a man named Johannes Krooms. Johannes Krooms, was a young man on a commute. He was in his mid-20s, and on the ferry to New York City, he watched and eyewitnessed, along with all of his other passengers, a plane crashing in the Hudson. And as the plane came down to the water and landed as a crash landing, but safely, no one was hospitalized or injured. I guess some people were hospitalized, but with minor injuries, but no one died. And to crash a plane successfully is obviously a Tom Hanks role. But what's interesting about this is that Johannes Krooms was on the boat, and that day he took what now is okay, but he took a vertical photo through the window of the ferry and tweeted, going over to pick these people up from the Hudson, crazy. So his ferry was closest. What's interesting is while he had taken this photo and posted it to Twitter, people were still trying to get to the pier to see this close up. It was actually closest to CBS News on the west side of New York City. And while people were going there, by the time news reporters had ended up on the side, Johannes had already sold his photo to the Charlotte Observer and the LA Times for over $40,000. And his photo made front page news. Many photographers work their entire lives to get a front page photo, and Johannes took a photo with his iPhone 3G. Many of you won't remember the iPhone 3G, but it's kind of like the iPod, I guess, the one with the curved back. The 3G had the curved back. They weren't squared off. And it was one of the original phones, and it didn't really take a clear photo, and he took it through the plastic glass on the thing, and his photo isn't even that great. It cuts off the back of the plane. But what's important is that he changed the way that we interact with information. We started desiring the idea of citizen journalism. And citizen journalism is the idea that any of us with a phone, a device, or a camera become the ability to be in the fourth estate. And that is the ability to translate information from a larger source to a public. And that's what journalism does. Journalism has a role in our society, but all of the founding fathers, regardless of how much they had disdain for reporters, appreciated and required journalism to be part of the Constitution. It is literally built into the First Amendment. The First Amendment allows freedom of the press and freedom of speech. That's where journalists operate. Freedom of the press is often thought of as the reporter, and it's not. Press means the machine, the press. They literally meant the press. It was previous to the rolling press, so they were still using the Gutenberg press at the time, which they were laying out full-scale print and then making it. Here in the back here is an actual front page from the New York Daily Tribune in 1849. That was likely made on a rolling press. So it's after the steam engine, they would make press more widely distributed, so it was higher to produce, so they could produce more at once. But before that, they were using the press, literally. And so the First Amendment protects that. Freedom of speech protects the content within that. And so everything you say is protected by your freedom of speech. And that's how important it is for journalists. Now, a journalist's job overall is to take information that you're not really aware of, do a translation, and give that to the public. It creates a better, more informed society. The better, the more informed society allows us to what we call in journalism, bringing truth to power. Because with power means you could sway truth. You could take truth and make it your own. You could take things and move them out. You could use something known as rhetoric or persuasive speech to convince somebody of something that you think is right, even though you're completely fabricating it. And without having a comparison to an objective reality, that's the reality in which we exist, where gravity is and everything, there's no way really to know what's real and what's not. And so journalists spend a fair amount of time and a fair amount of money to go to school to learn how to do journalism. I was a journalist briefly while I did video journalism and video digital producing, and I taught journalism for about 5 to 6 years. I still teach journalism occasionally, depending on the trips, and I do journalism documentary when I go to Rome and we do reporting on neo-fascist movements. And the reason we do this is because with an informed society, we're likely to make better decisions. And this isn't about media literacy, which makes us better consumers, but journalism actually makes us better citizens. The ability to interact with each other on the scale of knowledge, the ability to turn raw data into information, into knowledge, and then hopefully wisdom. It makes you somebody wiser, somebody who has a more idea of all the things that have happened, what we call well-read. And that means consuming a lot of information and news to become better at knowing that there's more than one side to every story, which is usually true. But the idea of both sides, though, isn't completely true because there's something known as good faith and bad faith actors. A good faith actor is someone who's trying their best to tell the truth and doing it with a sincere attitude. A bad faith actor is well aware of the truth and goes out of their way to spin it a different way. And that's somebody who is already fairly aware of the outcome and the audience. So over the past few years, I would say since not since Giannis Crooms, but probably since the 2013-2014 era, we've been in an era of falsified information, amplification models that are built solely on using information that is blatantly incorrect for profit models. And that's what fake news is. That's when news is actually not real in any way, or in a very slight way, or by omission. In other words, it's real, but it's leaving out facts that don't work for its intended story. And that leads us to something like clickbait or SEO, search engine optimization, which we'll get into next week. But clickbait is like headline writing that gets you to click on it or share it without reading it. And that's something that is often embedded into the models that allow us to connect with sites. I freelance for clickbait sites. Forbes magazine isn't clickbait, so to speak, but a lot of the articles the contributors put together are designed specifically for SEO, keyword writing, ways in which I could get views on my writing. I try my best to do my due diligence and tell stories that are factually accurate, and it takes me some time to put those together. And that therein is one of the most important aspects of what I want you to gain from this week. Time. Time is one of the most important aspects of journalism in general. When Giannis Chromes posted his photo to Twitter, there was not much facts to verify. The plane had crashed, there were people in it, and he has a photo on there. The news reporters then took his photo and added their story to it. That made it journalism, it makes it news. But when people realize their power to produce and be a publisher and to create their own media and create new media, they then take the publisher and editorial out of the structure. Editors in general were designed, well, pretty much forever, to read over someone's work before it goes to publication. It's not just for litigiousness, to make sure that somebody's not suing for libel. Libel and slander are part of the penalties that happen in the First Amendment. In other words, you're allowed to say whatever you want in this country, but you have to face the consequences if you create libel, which is if you lie in print, there are consequences. You're not protected against libel. But editors do their best, and copy editors do their best to remove any type of falsified information as to protect themselves and protect the writer, because you could lose your money many times, but you can only lose your reputation once. Or that used to be the case. Now it seems like you lose your reputation quite a many times and can recover in many different ways depending on your privilege and levels of access. This all being said, the idea of journalism has changed to a profit model rather than a journalism model. And I would say one of our main factors for this is the degradation of news, just in general, journalism in general. And that has to do with two things, too. One, conglomerations. Corporations eating up smaller news outlets. Small news is expensive. It's very hard to run a newsroom in a small town when there's no funding for it. So oftentimes big corporations would gobble them up and distribute large news to small towns. Small towns don't really care sometimes about big news, but they're given that through their major corporations. So then they're given that information from a place where they're like not so interested, so they disconnect from it, or they don't like paying the subscription fees to a newspaper that's not really about their local information. What we used to call something called hyperlocal. Second thing, Facebook. Facebook changed everything. When Facebook's profit model aimed for news, they tried to figure out a way to A, consolidate news networks directly into their news feed, which meant prioritizing clickbait, whatever people were interested in, so rage, anger, things that were sensational, became the most important things to look at, regardless of their veracity. And so that's where my favorite word comes from, verisimilitude, the appearance of real. Some things just became real enough that they were shareable, and Facebook privileged that type of content. A lot of pivots happen, a lot of long stories that are beyond the scope of an introduction course to social media, but a lot of changes within the profit model changed the way that we interact with information in general. Then, in the last 3 to 4 years, in the last 2 more than anything else, Facebook's profit model changed to groups. Local information, local news stopped having editorial and started being localized inside of groups. Groups, as many of you know, are private. They don't have access to information outside of it. And therefore, the only people who act as editors are content moderators. And content moderators are usually the people that started the group. Content moderation is really important because it acts as a veracity checker, a way of getting real information and objective reality back into everything, but it's exhausting and overwhelming. There's so much to do to keep making sure that A, truth is coming through these feeds, that you're responsible for a community's well-being, and a well-being meaning that everybody's not going crazy like in the end of the Kingsman or whatever that thing is where they all go nuts. And it's also designed to make sure that people feel as if they are aware of what's going on around them. This can have major problems. Your homework tonight is to read a very, very important article that just came out from Brandy Zadrozny, senior investigative reporter at NBC News, who's on the dystopia beat with Ben Collins. And she writes this article about a small Pennsylvania town that actually turned to Facebook groups almost exclusively to get their local news information, to what would be considered to many people a disaster. There's an interesting quote in the article that she writes when she reports on one of the people who use the group. It says, it allows people It allows people to make more informed decisions about local news stories without being told what to think about it. And that's interesting. That's what the member wrote. Local information versus broad information. So first part here is that they were interested in having information that helps them make decisions without being told how to think about it. So what you hear is that's a loaded sentence because that means they already have a bias against corporate media. So it's a deconstruction of major systems in general that they believe that corporatized media is biased, which in many cases it is. Corporatized media has a slant one way or another. That comes from its reporters, it comes from its corporation, it comes from everything. It is a longer, more nuanced story that we could get into at any point if you're really interested in keeping on going with this. But in many cases, the slant and the bias is designed for two things. One, the audience. Who is watching? That's where the slant goes. They need to profit, so the audience is usually spoken to. This is a degradation of corporate news because slanting that information makes them unreliable to the audience they're not speaking to. Two, profit. So if a major news system or the massive audience is going towards one direction, it's because it's what we call a general audience, like a G rating. And the general audience, A, doesn't like to really be pressured or feel uncomfortable in many ways. So a lot of the information is turned into a way that the majority of people get their information. And the majority, even if it's more than 51%, makes the profit model for them. So the slant comes from a generalized content information or soft news. But also one of the most important things here is that they're interested in not being told what to do. In other words, they are now pre-biased or confirmation bias. That information is now telling you how to do things. The second part of the bite is really important. The member rights. And last but not least, it allows us to post critical information long before the news even covers the story. And to me, that's one of the most dangerous parts of this entire article that I want you to read, because it tells you that they want information now. And the article takes a big case study about something that happened that probably needed time to understand, to diagnose, to see all the people involved. A typical person only sees things from one point of view. A journalist's usual goal, is to find as many points of view as possible and synthesize the story into something that you could understand and bring with you as knowledge. Raw information is not news. That is just information. So news is a compilation of a lot of synthesized ideas that get one place. But they've been trained via Facebook to want critical information now rather than understanding. And that is what's a critical problem, literally a critical problem of news in general. That is a degradation of society. One of the content moderators, one of the founders, says something that's very interesting there. Without any guidance from Facebook, she does all this work without even getting paid to do it. And that, I think, is one of the most interesting takeaways in general, which is that Facebook does not compensate you for doing this work. Then it expects you to keep on doing it because you're running a group with so many members that if you stop doing it, they would start a new one, and you're pretty much the only filter between reality and non-reality. But most importantly is there's no rules. Facebook makes its rules after you've done them. And so if you make up a new rule or you create it, Facebook adopts that rule, but they don't train you how to do it because they want to make profit models fluid. I think all of you know my feelings on Facebook at this point. I think it's one of the most biggest disasters we'll see historically in the history. And the fact that every single decision of a major company that almost 3 billion human beings use goes through one single human being is the biggest problem that we'll probably face for the next decade. That's neither here nor there. But what is here and there in this is that Facebook is telling this small community where to get their information from, even if it's not filtered properly. So for homework, it's a bit of a creative assignment. It's only a discussion board, and I really just want you to ask yourself after reading this, hey, what's your favorite part of this article? What was the thing that stuck out more than anything else? And two, what do you do when you encounter fake news? What do you do to combat that? Do you have a method? Is your method successful? Have you used this method before? Do you understand how to combat fake news? Or are you just as confused and overwhelmed by fake news as everyone else? Be a little bit candid here. You, again, with all of these, you have the ability to post or respond. You have to post at least once, and that's what I would really appreciate. And I really am interested in any types of techniques you've used in your personal life that interact or combat, most likely if you're interested in combating, fake news. How do you give people more information? What do? Do you have a technique that's valuable that we can all use? It would obviously be very helpful if you have one that has worked. I have my own, but That's my job as somebody who's been trained for it. I'm more interested in what you use because you're probably not wrong when you use your techniques. I'm just curious as to what you're doing with it. So again, the part of the article that is most fascinating to you is a bit of a long article. And the second part is what's your technique of combating or interacting with fake news. So from there, we're going to go next week. So this is a shorter week. I'm going to give you this will be due. It's going to overlap our next lecture. Our next lecture comes out at the end of this week, and then it's going to overlap that assignment because this will be due in a week from today. And then our next assignment's due circles around, but it's a little easier because we're going to be moving into marketing and it's a little bit more creative. So I'm really looking forward to us wrapping up the semester for some creative projects and seeing where you go with all of this accumulated knowledge that you've gotten, because now you should, at this point, have an objective idea of how social media operates. So looking forward to more. As always, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay curious.